we're going to start by looking at some of the different possible types of numbers that occur in maths. First, we have natural numbers. These are simply positive whole numbers, 1, 2, 3 and so on. We use capital N to represent the natural numbers. Next up are integers, which contain positive and negative whole numbers including 0. So it contains all of the natural numbers, but also -1, -2 and so on. To represent the integers, we use the letter Z. I believe that comes from the German word Zahlen, which can mean number. Next up we have rational numbers, represented by the letter Q, and they are any number that can be expressed as a fraction. So that includes simple decimals like 3.4 or 2.567. It also includes recurring decimals as well. Hopefully you can remember from GCSE that you can write any recurring decimal as a fraction. Following on from the rational numbers, we have the real numbers represented by the letter R. The real numbers contains all of the rational numbers and also some irrational numbers. These are numbers that cannot be expressed as fractions. Some examples of irrational numbers you may have already come across. We could have √2, we could have pi, and you may have also met e. These are all irrational numbers. There are many more. Before we define what a function is, we're going to talk about a mapping. So a mapping defines a relationship between a set of input and output values. That means if you have some input values, the mapping tells you how to get from those input values to a set of output values. So more specifically then, a function is a mapping where each input maps to a single output. With a mapping you could have an input value and it could give you several output values. With a function that's not the case. You put a number in and you get a single number out. Related to functions then, we have something called domain and range. The domain of a function is simply the set of numbers that you're allowed to put into the function, the input values. And the range of a function is a set of possible output values. So in the A-level course, you'll meet a couple of different ways functions will be expressed. You'll probably be broadly familiar with them from GCSE, but there are a couple of details that you need to make sure you're aware of at A-level. So in our example here, we have f of x equals 3x plus 2. That's called the rule. On the right hand side here, we have -6 is less than x is less than or equal to 7, and we're told that x is a real number. This part is called the domain of the function. It's giving us specific details about what the input values can be. A different kind of notation that's often used is here. We have an f followed by a colon x and an arrow, and then the rule is written. And then for our domain, we're told x is in the region -6 to 7. The curved bracket tells us that -6 is not included in the region, whereas the square bracket tells us that 7 is included. So we can have any number between -6 and 7, but we can't have -6, and we can have 7. Again, we've got x's in the real numbers. We can also have different combinations of the notation here. So there's no reason that this rule has to be written with the domain in this form. We could have this rule and the domain written in the form below. And if we have our function defined with a rule and a domain, we can express it using something called a mapping diagram. In a mapping diagram, we have two regions. The region on the left represents the input values or the domain, and the region on the right represents the range or the output values. So in the example here, we have several input values. We've got negative numbers, 0, surds and fractions all allowed because x just has to be a real number, provided these values are between -6 and 7. For each value, we've got an arrow going from the input to the output. For example here, we've got -3. If we do 3 lots of -3, that's -9, plus 2 gives us -7. The 3 dots here at the bottom, called an ellipse, tell us that there are other possibilities for the domain and other possibilities not shown for the range.